All right. Greetings, Gamer Nation. I'm Eliza Lambert. So you've played D&D, you've cast a wish to wish for more wishes, and used Mage Hand to extract gemstones from the hindquarters of halflings. What else does the world of tabletop role-playing games have to offer you? Today, we're here to discuss Night's Black Agent, the RPG of vampires and conspiracy. Also worth noting, perhaps the greatest campaign of all time, the Dracula Dossier, was written for this game. Here to discuss it with me is the game's creator, Ken Hite. Ken, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks. Eliza, thanks for having me on.
I'm excited to talk nerdy. It's going to be fun. I got a few questions for you.
All righty, hit me.
So, what do the characters do in your game?
In Night's Black Agents, I call it a vampire spy thriller. Characters are, paradigmatically, they're burned spies. They're Jason Bourne, basically. They used to do spy stuff, then they stopped. They work for shadowy figures, again, by default in the European criminal espionage underground. They discover vampires exist. Maybe they've done a job for a vampire. Maybe they've seen vampires on their job. And so then that's sort of the inciting incident. And that can either have happened in the past or it can happen during play, depending on how the campaign runs. But once they do that, they hunt vampires. And because the vampires know that they know, so they've got, a window of opportunity. They have to keep hunting the vampires or else they're going to get turned into lunch, because the vampires are definitely hunting them. So it's basically inspired by my thoughts of, this was when, Hunter the Vigil had gone out of print. The Buffy game had gone out of print. There weren't any vampire hunting games. And I thought there needs to be a vampire hunting game. Who would hunt vampires? Jason Bourne would hunt vampires. And that was literally like the 30 seconds I spent thinking of that on a train station in Chicago. That became the game. So everything that wasn't Jason Bourne hunts vampires sort of comes off the side. So if you want to be James Bond hunting vampires, you can do that. You want to be George Smiley hunting vampires, you can do that. Whatever your spy is and whatever your vampires are, because the sort of the point of the game is figuring out their powers and abilities, strengths, weaknesses, whatever. Does garlic stop them? Do crosses stop them? Can they walk around in the sunlight? Are they satanic Transylvanian counts? Were they built by a KGB bioweapons program? Where do vampires come from? All that is the mystery that you're solving while you're being hunted by them and while you hunt them. So that adds the sort of investigative mystery solving part that the Gumshoe engine, which is the game engine that it runs on, is meant to model. Someone has said that a thriller is just a sped up mystery, or a sped up mystery where you know who did it at the beginning. And I think that's a little unfair to thrillers, but certainly structurally, there's a really good argument for that. And so that's basically what I did, is I took the Gumshoe investigative engine from Trail of Cthulhu and Esoterrorists, and I just sped it up, and I added, as you mentioned, the conspiracy angle, so that you have something to hunt the vampires through, which is to say their maze of tools and minions and servant organizations and places that they've corrupted before you finally find them and hopefully, kill them all so that they can't come after you.
Yeah. So you said that you kind of get to decide, you as the player get to kind of endow the vampires with powers or kind of abilities and character traits.
You as the game master do that, and then the players, figure it out is one of the things that they do in the course of the game. But the vampires are fully modular, so the GM can build them any way that the GM wants to. Any way that she wants to, she can think, oh, I really like Spike from Buffy. I think that vampires should be Spike. And so now vampires are all possessed by demons. They have, the various powers and abilities that Buffy vampires do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or she may be, into Tim Powers and say, I want vampires that are weird stone creatures from a previous era of the earth, and they come alive in statues, and it's all messed up and romantic, and their powers are strange and misunderstood. You can build those kind of vampires. So it's literally just the whole smorgasbord of vampires from folklore through fiction and movies, and then you, the GM, assemble your vampires the way that you want, but then that will leave clues as they hunt the players for the players to figure out.
Oh, cool. So as someone who's only played D&D, what will I find familiar in this game and what will be different?
I think that one of the things that it's kind of weirdly familiar about this game for D&D is that although there's a lot of abstract problem solving that is not necessarily D&D's forte, and certainly not its rules forte, it really does come down to sort of set piece combats more than maybe other Gumshoe games does, because it's Jason Bourne, right? It was always meant to be Jason Bourne. Those movies are really about the fights in a way that other movies aren't. So, you try to make sure that the fights are meaningful, that they're interesting, that they're super challenging, and that the players have lots of different tactical choices and opportunities to make. It's not going to be necessarily the same, I'm the magic user, you're the cleric, he's the thief, she's the fighter, that you're used to. You're all kind of fighters because, again, Jason Bourne, but maybe one of you's the explosives expert, and one of you's the wheelman, and one of you's the sniper, and one of you's the close-in knife guy. And so there's a bunch of different ways that you can come together. And so your characters don't have classes, but they have what I call backgrounds, and you can build your characters out of those background packages if you want, and have a sort of an understanding of what your character is. So that's, I think, one of the big commonalities with D&D is that it really is, it's about fighting at the base. It's a for all the pretense that I make to it being intellectual, it really is just about, John Woo style, gunplay against vampires. But but that's something. And then the other thing that I think, depending on the game master, there's a lot of subsidiary monsters in the book that come in from vampire lore. So to an extent that D&D is about figuring out tactical challenges, this game is about some of that as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's no magic in this game. Like it's all about real things in the real world. Just the element of vampires, or?
I mean, there can be magic if you've decided, for example, in Dracula is described by Van Helsing as a alchemist and as having powers of sorcery. Now, he doesn't wind up using those necessarily, unless the way that he summons the wind to blow the Demeter to England is sorcery. And when he, has the magic weather around him when he's going back to Romania, is that sorcery? Is that just an inherent vampire power? Who knows, right? That's part of the elliptical enigmatic part of that novel, and it's also part of what vampires do. So, certainly, as the lead designer of Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition, I'm very familiar with the long tradition in games of vampires that are also magicians. So if that's something you want, you can build that right into your vampires. And then once you've figured out the mechanics for the magic, in theory, you could borrow magic from, say, Trail of Cthulhu, or any of the PDFs that I did online about alchemy or Elizabethan magic or voodoo or whatever else. And if you decided we're adding magic, I can't stop you. It's not part of the default universe. But if you think of, for example, the Charles Strauss's series of novels about a spy hunting Cthulhu mythos entities, he also uses magic. So you could, yeah, sure. There's magical spies, I'm saying. Why not?
I like the open-endedness, availability of that.
But it does take a little bit of, I don't want to say it's all in the book there. The vampire magic is easy because he's an NPC. So the GM's like, all right, it costs him 3 points to do something really terrible, 2 points to do something sort of terrible, and 1 point to do something kind of terrible, and no points just to mess with you, right? And if that's what you've decided, and it's very easy for the GM to run them. Player magic should be more annoying, and they should have to keep more track of it. Otherwise, it gets out of hand. So you do have to sort of borrow from other Gumshoe games or other PDFs that I've done for Gumshoe to add those elements. But the reason that the games are all on the same basic engine is to make them that kind of interoperable, if that's what you want.
Yeah. And as far as combat goes, is it pretty frequent? Is it a combat heavy kind of RPG, or is it more of the problem solving that you were talking about and more of the
I mean, that again, that balance is kind of down to the GM. But I will say that there's rules not just for the basic combat, but there's sort of advanced combat options. Jumping in ahead of your turn in the round, shooting 2 guns, auto fire, suppressing fire, all the fun stuff. And you decide as a group or as the GM, depending on what your group is like, how deep into that box you want to go. And if you want to use them all, great. But I feel like if you've decided that, you probably want to do more combat. And again, the model is the Bourne movies. The Bourne movies are about fights, but
yeah.
there is an argument that you could, in theory, run a game in which you do nothing but outthink the vampires until you get to their big nest, and then you fight them at the end. Or better yet, you just pour thermite in and set it on fire and hope. But I don't think a lot of games wind up running that way because, again, vampires tend to hire Russian mobsters to guard them. And so at some point you have to get through those guys. And 9 times out of 10, I think that's going to be a fight scene. But are you the kind of person who runs lots of thinking and deducting and solving and wiring around and then one fight at the end? Or are you the kind of person who's like, everything that you get, like again in the Bourne movies, comes at the expense of a fight? You have to beat someone up to get more knowledge. That's just the way that Bourne works. Therefore, that's the way my game works. The game will support either one. I feel like because, it's a sort of a hammer nail situation. If all you got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you have a big option heavy combat system, people will tend to use it more than if it's just a straightforward roll like everything else is. But again, the source material very much valorizes and accentuates fighting, so does the game. I feel personally, as an old retrograde guy, that a thriller is not complete if it doesn't have at least one good fight in it. So that's just my way of thinking.
All right. What is one of your peak moments playing Knights, Blacks, Agents? Well, I suppose whether playing or running it.
I mean, I have not played it as a player. I've only run it. It's one of the games, I don't always do this, but I did because I was not sure that the Gumshoe engine would stretch to be a thriller. So I play tested the game as I was designing it for my standard Monday night play group. And we very early on, I mean, first of all, it's a great play group. So there's nothing but peak moments really with them. But we very early on realized that a lot of their habits were going to get them into trouble. And one of the ways that we figured that out was, and this was, again, because it was a playtest, I was trying to gauge how powerful should a vampire be, sort of a standard vampire. So I built what I thought was a standard vampire, and rather than have them run their characters into this guy first thing, I said, here's a bunch of Serbian gangsters, pre-generated characters for you to play. And you've heard that there's this guy who's been cutting in on your human trafficking, and he's hiding out in this abandoned palazzo in Venice. So go in and teach him a lesson. So they, armor up whatever they want. I'm like, yes, absolutely. You're the Serbian mob. You can have anything. They carry it into the palazzo, and then I just unleashed the vampire. And because they weren't regular player characters, I didn't have to hold back at all. And he very gratifyingly massacred all of them. It was really good. And so in game then, later on in the game, the player characters stumbled on a videotape of those Serbian gangsters in Venice, right? They'd been surveilled by some other organization. I forget, or if they'd set up their own video, but hadn't gone to collect it. And so the players are watching the video of themselves be massacred by this vampire, but because vampires in that campaign didn't show up on videotape, all they see is sort of the invisible, their characters just sort of lifting up in the air and their blood spraying out, that kind of thing. And the meta of the players role-playing, reacting, and I think to some degree remembering what it felt like to just be turned into chopped liver, I think that really elevated it to a level that if I hadn't run that with them in it, it wouldn't have made the same sort of visceral impact. Not to use a pun, but visceral impact. And so I think that was early on, that sort of set the tone in it, and it told the players, yeah, we can't just goof around and, you know, blunder through this. We have to sort of outthink these guys. We have to figure out what's going on. And that sort of gave me the, like I say, the sort of balance between investigation and combat that I wanted it to have. That if you went up against vampires unprepared, you should and would get massacred.
All right. So tell me a little bit about the creative team behind the game.
Well, I guess when you say the team behind the game, it should begin with Robin Laws, who is my Canadian life partner on our podcast. Ken and Robin talk about stuff. He's the designer of the Gumshoe engine in the first place. He designed Esoterrorists back in 2006 or 7. Terrific game designer, and he designed that Gumshoe engine that I was then hired by Pelgrane Press to use as the core of Trail of Cthulhu. And then when I thought, oh, I should do a vampire hunting game, I thought, well, I was able to sell Pelgrane on Trail of Cthulhu. I wonder if I can sell them this vampire hunting game. And so I did. And long story short. And so the writing and design out from Robin's Gumshoe engine was all me. And then it went to Chris Huth, who did the layout and a lot of the art. I'm not sure if it was all of the art, but it was a lot of the art. And then was edited by Simon Rogers. Let's see who else is in the credits here. Oh, we had Phil Reeves and Alessandro Alaya, and then Beth Lewis, who was at that time associate producer at Pelgrane, did sort of the rest of it. George Catronis did the cover art. So there is the end
There
result.
we go. I love it.
Yep. And this was, you know, sort of my idea that there should be a spy on the cover, and he should be just like Jason Bourne. And it's harder to see because of the darkness, but he should have a gun in one hand, which he does. You can see the gun, and a stake in his other hand, and you could barely see his stake.
Ready for vampire hunting.
The cross should not be a cross, but it should be a gun sight.
Oh.
So I thought that set the good. And then George drew this amazing, horrible looking vampire, this messed up vampire. And so just having him with his arms around him, and then I said, and make sure it's an urban backdrop on the art. So that was, I think that may have been the most collaborative I ever got with the art. A lot of, you know, my job was just write it and turn it over. And then they did, you know, the standard terrific job. And I think I wanted a different font than we wound up using, because I wanted Eurostyle, and Robin had just used Eurostyle for his space game, Ashen Stars. And I wanted Eurostyle again because it's the font that the Chirons in the Bourne Identity are in. And it's like, nope, you can't have Eurostyle. And I think the Chirons in Alias are in Eurostyle as well. And so we got a version of Gil Sands that looks really good, but it's not Eurostyle. But then we have our own cool little font choices. But those were all, I think, Chris doing the layout and building that out. So it was sort of, on the one hand, it was me by myself, but on the other hand, it was also me by myself with Robin's engine and Chris's art and Beth's production. And without all those people, you know, it would be a pile of manuscript like it was. I think that there was an ash can that we sold at Dragon Meat that was literally just my initial turned in manuscript, and they bound it and sold it to early adopters and super fans, which is fun. And I'm not arguing, it paid for my flight to London, but I think the game is better with the art and the binding and the rest of it myself.
So I've been told by my co-creator that the greatest campaign of all time, bar none, the Dracula Dossier, is for Nice Black Agents. Can you tell me a little bit about that campaign?
Well, I mean, I would put us no higher than the third best, just to push back a little bit against Ben.
This is my co-creator's
Right.
opinion.
I mean, I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm just saying that I personally would put Great Pendragon Campaign and Massive Nyarlathotep above it. That said, yes. That's the director's handbook. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
Yep. And then along with it is Dracula Unredacted.
Ooh.
Right. And what this is the novel Dracula, the original Stoker novel,
The original.
but
Okay.
unredacted. The conceit of the campaign is that Bram Stoker's novel is not a novel. It is an after-action report based on a failed British intelligence attempt to recruit a vampire in 1894. And when he turned in his after-action report, they said, well, we're not ever going to act on this. And also, your after-action report reveals too much. And they cut out a quarter of it and then had it released as a novel as a disinformation op, so that if anyone ever heard that they tried to recruit a vampire and his name was Dracula, people would say, that's a novel. Stop messing with us. So in 1894, they recruited a vampire. It went horribly wrong. Well, let's never speak of it again. But the part of intelligence that recruited the vampire kept all the information. And so in 1940, when Britain is standing alone against Hitler and they're trying anything to stop him, Operation Edom, which is the name of this tiny group in MI6, says, well, we have an asset in Romania we could possibly reactivate. And if he could take over Romania, he could stop Hitler. And so they sent in a team into Romania to wake Dracula back up and try and send him after Hitler. And that worked about as well as you think. I mean, you may recall that Hitler took over Romania with no trouble. There was a bit of a confusion there. And so the survivor of that found the original Dracula that he was issued as his briefing and annotated it and put it back into the files. And then in the 70s, MI6 is got a big leak of information to Romania, and they're trying to find the leak, and where could the leak be? And someone says, oh, it might be from this immortal Romanian that was wandering around at London for a year, leaving, and he could mind control people and he could make other, that might be it. We'll hunt your leak down for you. And so the team that hunts the mole, the Dracula's mole in the agency, the head of that team then puts their annotations into it. And they, having seen the first batch of annotations, said, I'm not sure I trust my bosses. So they put something into the computers that would trigger this being released again if it looked like Edom was once more trying to wake up Dracula for some stupid reason. And again, during the War on Terror, after the 7/7 bombings, Edom gets permission to wake up Dracula, who, remember, fought the Turks his whole earthly life, and use him to go eat Al-Qaeda on the grounds that, he's the perfect deniable asset. He's a fictional asset. You can't be more deniable than that. And so he's been out there since 2011 or 2007 eating Al-Qaeda and ISIS and whoever else he wants to. And the guy that stumbles on that gets, he got this dumped into his inbox, annotates it, and then disappears. And this becomes the player handout. So it's this book.
A lot of history in that book.
With 3 generations of MI6 annotations. Every annotation becomes a clue and will lead you to a person, an organization, a place, an item, something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every one of
so
those.
Where can I get my hands on that book?
every one of those possible clues is in the director's handbook. So the GM has this. Director is what we call the GM in Night's Black Agents. And so every one of those NPCs, like here we have this Idris Elba looking guy. He's a American oil company executive, right? Romania has oil deposits, so maybe he's connected somehow. And so we have his name. We have roles he might play in your campaign. He's in the footnotes. And then there's 3 different versions of him. There's one as an innocent. He's just an American oil executive. He's got nothing to do with any of this. There's his role as an asset if he's a CIA or MI6 asset, and his role as a minion if he's been corrupted into Dracula's power structure. And you, the GM, decide. The players, they find the hint that there's an American oil executive in the footnotes, and they say, we want to find that guy. He sounds dodgy. He sounds sus. They meet him in the scenario. The GM decides which version of him to use, gives them the proper responses and clues, and then they take those clues and go somewhere else. So the campaign is completely collaborative. The players decide what clues they want to pursue. I mean, we've given them literally the biggest clue handout in the history of role-playing games. They decide on their own what clues they want to go to. The GM then takes those clues, decides their nature and significance, and hands it back to the players, and the players run with that in whatever direction they want. They either keep going up that chain, or they say, all right, we've pegged him. Now we're going to go to this other person, this photojournalist, or this, or we say, what about Lucy Westenrosh? I know she was staked, but maybe she's still lurking around England as a vampire. And so there's ways to track Lucy Westenrosh or any of the original characters, their descendants in the modern day, any of the people. For example, the actual, in history, real life deputy director of MI5 in World War II, his last name was Harker. So obviously he's related to the original Jonathan Harker. He has to be. That's just logic. So we have him in there as a character. And so you can maybe find his diary or whatever. Or if you're doing a version of the game where you begin in 1894 and play all the way through, you do that one. Or you're just playing the World War II setting, you can do that. So it's really entirely collaborative. It's entirely modular. It's entirely player driven as to what kind of story you want to pursue, which means, as Ben can tell you, you can play it back to back to back and have 3 entirely different outcomes because the players have determined where you're going every time. And then we wrote 4 or 5 capstones, which are sort of final adventure versions, depending on where you track Dracula to. Do you track him to his tomb? Is he underneath a waterfall in Romania called Dracula's Mill, which we found on a very old map of Romania? Is he, planning to vampirize Putin and take over a nuclear power? Maybe that's his plan. Who knows what he's up to, right? So we have a bunch of different end games for Dracula to have that you then reach by whatever route you feel like you wanted to. And it always feels organic because you, the player, decided the route. There's no railroading. It's literally like pachinko. You bouncing around in all possible kind of ways to go, right? So that's that's in a, not even a nutshell, in a nutbag, is the Dracula Dossier story. Well, yeah, maybe that wasn't what I wanted to say either.
What do players need to get to in order to play your game, whether the original campaign version or the Dracula Dossier? Is there an online place to get it, or is it only a physical book?
Well, obviously, any good game store, by definition, has it in stock physically. The only thing you need to play Night's Black Agents is a copy of the core book, and everyone should have a 6-sided die, and that's it. And you can get it on, and you can get it online in a PDF from Pelgrane. You can get it on at Drive-Thru RPG if that's how you shop. You should obviously go to your game store and get the physical version because it's prettier and nicer that way, but I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. And then once you've done that, you're good. I believe that there's dedicated suites for it on Roll20 if you want to play virtually. Character builders and things like that are available. So if all you can do or all you want to do is play virtually or electronically, go right ahead and do that. Then for the Dracula Dossier, the minimum requirement, I personally feel, is both of the books I just showed you, the Director's Handbook and the Unredacted. But in theory, you could play it just with the Director's Handbook and a copy of Dracula. Now, you won't have any of the footnotes. You won't have any of the,
the clues,
super easily digestible leads. But there's still tons of stuff in Dracula that's weird and messed up because we found it when we were doing it. So there's there's advice in the Director's Handbook for how to play it with just a copy of Dracula. I don't personally think that you're getting, it's like you bought a Maserati, you only use it on city streets and never on the highway. I feel like you're not getting all the power you can, but in theory, that's what you can do. And then there's more stuff in the Dracula Dossier universe. Do I want to say that? There's a adventure collection called the Edom Files, which takes you from the foundation of Edom in 1877, when George Stoker, Brahm's brother, first finds vampires in the Russo-Turkish War, all the way down to the modern era. Adventures over the history of the Cold War, basically, and over the history of England, from 1877 down to the present. And those can be slotted into your campaign if you're playing from 1894 to now. They can be flashbacks, they can be backstory, you can ignore them completely. And then we have something called the Edom Field Manual. If you're thinking, well, this is all well and good, but Edom are clearly the good guys. They've got Dracula and he's out there eating terrorists. I want to play Edom guys. Well, the Edom Field Manual lets you build a Edom-only campaign, and you don't have to worry about those stupid player characters ruining it with their do-gooderness. So there's a lot of sort of roads into the Dracula Dossier, and we have a packet of handouts called the Hawkins Papers that is only PDFs now because the physical ones were a Kickstarter reward, and they nearly destroyed publisher Kat Tobin, who basically cooked them all in tea in her own house for what seems like months to make them aged. But the PDFs are all great and glorious, and they again will feed a Dracula Dossier campaign literally from the 1890s to the present day, if that's what you want. Or you can just use the present day part, which is still pretty ample, and then have that stuff as just historical documents of interest.
But for someone who is just trying this for the first time, all they need is to get a book and one six-sided die. They don't need
one six-sided die and one Night's Black Agents core book, and they are ready to go. Absolutely.
That's all I need to hear. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. I'm going to give a little spiel about what we got coming up for all of our watchers and listeners here. On October 24th, I'm going to be learning about Blue Rose, the RPG of romantic fantasy. And the show's producer and co-creator, Ben Riggs, has a book on RPG adventure design theory called Encounter Theory, available on drivethrurpg.com right now. So check the show notes if you're interested in that. And if you like what you hear, email us at afterdndplay@gmail.com, or on Twitter, we are at afterdnd. So smash or mash that subscribe button below to never miss an episode, and tell a friend about the show. Thank you again, Ken, for joining us today and being on the show.
Thank you, Eliza, for having me. Happy to be here.
You had a great time.
I thought
and
so.
With that, I'm your guide to your next great geeky game, Eliza Lambert, signing off.